Well, it's more good news for Canada people this week. While Washington was busy calculating how desperate Canada would look on July 1st, Canada was boarding planes to Tokyo.
Nearly 300 delegates, 175 organizations, defense contractors, aerospace companies, critical mineral executives. All of them are in Japan this week, just days before the CUSMA deadline. And most Canadian outlets, they're barely mentioning it, as usual.
Now, we saw the same approach with Mexico, right? Canada brought business leaders, looked for investment, and started building relationships that could survive whatever happens in Washington. Well, Japan is the next major piece.
And listen, Japan already has $54.8 billion invested in Canada. $35.6 billion in merchandise trade last year alone. So Canada is not cold calling a stranger. These are two established partners deciding how much more they can build together.
So today, we're going to break down exactly what Canada is building in Tokyo, why Japan is the right partner for this specific moment, and what it means for every Canadian watching Washington play its usual games at the trade table.
Okay. Let's make sure everyone is clear on what Japan already means to Canada, because here's something that most people just really don't know. Japan is already Canada's largest source of investment from the entire Indo-Pacific. And this week's mission isn't about starting a relationship, it's about asking how much bigger it can get.
And the timing really does tell you everything here about why this is actually happening now. Mark Carney went to Tokyo back in March and signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi. Energy, defense, critical minerals, technology, all of that in one agreement.
So this week is where those agreements stop being words on paper and start becoming actual business conversations. International Trade Minister Maninder Sindhu brought the largest Team Canada trade mission to the Indo-Pacific since the program launched in 2023.
Now, and here's something interesting. Defense Minister David McGuinty came along for Canada's first defense trade mission of this kind to Japan. Economic security and military security. Ottawa is treating them as the same conversation, which, when you think about it, makes complete sense because they are.
And look, the bigger picture here is really straightforward and every Canadian knows it. Canada has relied on the United States for trade and continental defense for far too long. Japan has relied on the United States for security and market access for too long. And both countries are now staring at the same political weather, and both are deciding it might be wise to own more than one umbrella. You're seeing a trend develop here across all the middle powers.
Yeah, and Japan is the world's fifth largest economy. Remember that. It can work with Canada across energy, technology, manufacturing, and defense simultaneously. It also has very strong reasons to reduce its own exposure to American decisions.
Canadians have watched the lesson play out in real time all year. One tariff threat on steel or aluminum, and the ripple hits the auto workers in Ontario. The farmers in Saskatchewan, the family watching grocery prices, it's all happening. And Japan, they've watched the same thing happen to its own supply chains.
Yeah, Japan imports enormous amounts of energy and raw materials. It needs suppliers that it can count on. Canada has energy, uranium, critical minerals, food, forestry products, and a Pacific coastline that connects those resources directly to Asian markets. Just think about how the major projects that Carney announced yesterday could tie directly into this Indo-Pacific region.
Now, Canada also needs what Japan brings as well. Japanese companies have a track record of building real things right here. The Canadian government says Japanese companies now manufacture 70% of the vehicles built in Canada. That $54.8 billion figure is already in factories, workers, and supply chains across the country.
But hold it there. There's a thing. There is an awkward triangle buried inside this partnership that we have to talk about. Canada wants Japan as an alternative to depending entirely on the United States. But Japan wants Canada to preserve its connection to the American market because that's partly why Japanese companies invested here in the first place, especially in the auto sector.
It makes sense, but it is an awkward triangle. because Canada is trying to reduce American leverage while simultaneously reassuring Japan that the link to the American market is still valuable. Can it work? Well, that part is a wait and see at this point.
Now, the defense side of this mission, it's interesting because this is where Canada really is stepping up. Canada and Japan brought into force on June 16th, just a few days ago, a Security of Information Agreement and an Equipment and Technology Transfer Agreement.
So think of that as installing the legal wiring. Once those frameworks are in place, sensitive technology and information can move between the two countries under agreed protections. That's cool. Joint research, industrial partnerships, shared developments. Things that simply weren't possible before.
And McGuinty has also been talking to Japan about the Global Combat Air Program, or GCAP. GCAP is the next generation fighter aircraft being developed by Japan, Britain, and Italy, with a target service date of around 2035. Canada is now asking what participation in that could look like.
Wow. But to be clear, nobody should confuse this with Canada's current fighter procurement. GCAP is a long-term industrial project, so we're talking about advanced research, cutting-edge manufacturing, sensors, software, aerospace supply chains. Canada's participation would mean Canadian firms could have access to lasting decades of work.
Yeah, and it gives Canada a strategic option outside an American-led program. The U.S., it has its own next-generation fighter in development. But GCAP is the second major Western project. Canada would no longer have to assume every future air defense decision begins and ends with the U.S. That's the shift here.
And I like it. Now, Italy has signaled it would welcome partners willing to share development costs as well, and Canada has been named as a potential observer or future participant. Any expansion still requires approval from Japan, Britain, and Italy, so this is just an opening, not a finished deal, but is promising.
It definitely is. We also have to talk about Japan's shipbuilding sector, because Japan signed a roughly $7 billion warship agreement with Australia recently. And crucially, it included local construction inside Australia. Australian workers building the ships, not just Australian buyers writing the check. Sound familiar?
Very. And that model, that is what interests us Canadians. A defense partnership that includes Canadian production, Canadian technology, and Canadian jobs built right into the supply chain. It's not just a purchase agreement like we always get with the USA.
It's what Melanie Joly has been doing and talking about with Saab and with the submarines, all that kind of stuff. It's about building stuff here in Canada. Now, the challenge here, and this is real, it's turning access into contracts and contracts into actual work inside Canada. That's the big work. That part, it doesn't happen by itself.
But Mark Carney has proven that he's a master at that, so we will wait and see. But now let's put July 1st into perspective because some of the coverage has been fairly breathless about this deadline. Now, July 1st is a formal checkpoint. It's not a trapdoor that suddenly opens under the Canadian economy that afternoon. And we talked about this before in a previous video in the link below. But since the deadline is looming, it's worth a clarification.
Yeah. If the three countries don't agree on an extension, CUSMA doesn't disappear that day. The agreement moves into annual reviews and could continue through 2036. Sir, the uncertainty is real. It can discourage investment, which is exactly why Canada wants a clean extension. But panic helps Washington far more than it helps Canada. Carney's approach looks like calm, deliberate diversification. Preserve the North American relationship where possible, quietly make sure Canada can function when Washington becomes unreliable. Less theatrical than grand declaration, probably also way more useful. Success gets measured by investment commitments, research partnerships, export contracts, and jobs.
But the scale of this mission does signal something very important. Ottawa understands the opportunity, so the question is, what happens with the follow-through?
The strongest version of this partnership is straightforward. Japanese capital meets Canadian resources, workers, and technology. Japan gets secure, dependable supplies from a stable partner. Canada gets consumers who aren't tied to what one administration decides on a Tuesday morning.
Add defense cooperation on top of that, aerospace, shipbuilding, cybersecurity, advanced manufacturing, and these are the sectors that sustain high-quality Canadian jobs for decades.
So Canada and Japan are both what you call middle powers, countries that can't dominate the world alone, but have enough economic, diplomatic, and military weight to shape events when they work together. Japan, they're already building that network with Australia, Britain, Italy, and the Philippines. Canada is building it across Europe, the Arctic, and Asia.
Looks like we can be the bridge again. And these partnerships, they all overlap. They become harder for any one large power to pressure.
So here's our question for you today. If Canada delivers on even half of what this Japan partnership promises, does the U.S. arrive at the next CUSMA review with a significantly less leverage over Canada?
Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you think Japan is the right partner for this moment, we want to know where you stand.
So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like, a hype, and a share so other people get to see it too.
And check out the merch store and everything else in the links below. See you tomorrow, everybody.
Thanks for watching. Ciao for now.